Okay, we're just going to make sure that everything sounds and looks good. And after we do that, we are going to go ahead and get going. So just give me a second, make sure all the sound is good. And then after we do that, okay. I just think the last thing to do here is share things on Twitter. And after things are shared, we will go ahead and get going. And that will be that. Okay. All right, it looks like we are ready to get going. So let me just share this real quick. Okay. All right, so everything has been shared, which means it is absolutely 100% time to get going. So without further delay, here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are. This is UnShrink Me, a weekly podcast about clinical psychology, mental health, psychiatry, and all related topics. This is the UnShrink Me podcast hosted on my YouTube channel, The Psychology Checkup. I am Patrick Lockwood. In some cases, I'm even Dr. Patrick Lockwood. But in this case, I'm just Patrick. Feel free to sue me, fire me, cancel me, etc. I'm glad you're all here watching and listening. And as always, I look forward to people in the comments doing their thing. I hope that everyone understands the spirit of this podcast. If you're brand new, I want you to understand that the whole reason that I do this is because I want everyone to get the most out of their mental health professionals. And so to that effect, sometimes it's helpful to take popular psychology topics, things that are in the ether right now that are being discussed, and hopefully talk about them critically in a way that will allow people who are seeking out psychiatry, psychology, counseling, rehab, whatever it is, to use those topics in a way that's actually good for their mental health and not counterproductive. Because sometimes the stuff that's popular is myth or mythology. Sometimes it's overblown. Sometimes it's understated. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about today as well. So this is a podcast for the consumers. However, just so everyone knows, for legal matters, I am not giving any particular individual advice. So if you're watching and listening and you think that I am specifically speaking to you, no, I am not. I am making broad statements about general opinions and topics in the mental health world. So this is not clinical advice. Do not sue me, but feel free to cancel me. So today's podcast, I have a couple of interesting things to discuss. One that I think is very important, which came from some conversations earlier this week, is about how human beings are animals but not, and what that means for therapy and behavior change. We'll talk more about that. But we'll also talk about hope. We're also going to talk about attachment and other important things. And I always start off with a couple of softballs, so it's easy to warm up to. And for those of you who don't know, this podcast is not NOT, not sponsored by Celsius. However, really love this stuff. It's great. Grateful for it because it tastes good, gets me pumped up, etc. And so I want to start with a softball post today. And I want to talk about this post by this person named Anonymous Psychologist, who I've never talked to, I think, online before. Okay. So let me retweet their post real quick. And for those of you who are brand new, everything I'm discussing, I will be retweeting or reposting on Twitter. My handle on Twitter, if you are new to this, is at AlobhaPatrick, which is at ALOBHAPATRICK. Okay. So this person called the Anonymous Psychologist, which their handle is at Person Education. On May 22nd, they said the following. Much of psychiatry and much of the mental health system is about control and management of people, not healing. to say that again. This is the exact quote from their post from May 22nd. Much of psychiatry and much of the quote-unquote mental health system is about control and management of people, not healing. So, this is my softball warm-up post for the day because this is one of those overly simplistic things. Hello, Edmund. Glad you're here. This is one of those overly simplistic takes that you'll see on social media. And I think that it does patients a great disservice when we try to simplify their experience in clinical psychology and mental health systems. So, is it true, factually, that as a result of being in treatment, in rehab, in a psych hospital, in one-on-one therapy once a week, that you are better controlled and managed than if you were left to your own devices? I would say that on average, that's probably true. So from like the 30,000 foot perspective, is it fair to say that the mental health system helps control and manage people? Absolutely. Follow-up question. Does the mental health system do a good job of controlling people and managing people? I would say absolutely not. As evidenced by all of the relapses, all the people who AMA from treatment, all the people who never get better as a result of being in psych hospitals, outpatient clinics, one-on-one therapy. I would say that these psychiatric and mental health systems are systems that attempt to control people. But how effectively they do that, I think they do a very poor job of it. And so on the one hand, I agree, but on the other hand, I disagree. But then there's this strange dichotomy this person puts in there, which is that controlling and managing people is not healing. And I just have to vehemently disagree. Because for many people who are badly struggling, learning how to manage themselves is part of healing. Because until they get more under control, per se, they can't heal, right? So let me give you a very easy example. A person is diagnosed with a severe version of bipolar 1 or schizophrenia. People with those two illnesses often have very impaired lives, especially if it's the severe version of the diagnostic issue. And so they might also have trauma and drug problems and all these things. And maybe they need to heal. Maybe their brain needs to heal, their body needs to heal. But until you stop using drugs or until you stop acting out impulsively in mania, it's very, very hard to actually heal your body and your mind. And so for many people, step one of healing is getting more under control. And it's that simple. And I'm not saying that that's good, and I'm not saying that the systems that have been created are good at it or even ethical. What I'm saying is that until we can create better systems of accountability and person management, this is the best we have so far. So what I would love to see are alternative systems for managing people. You know, once upon a time in many cultures, religion and other social orders were managing people. But nowadays, especially in the West, we don't use religious systems to manage and control people as much. We use politics and mental health. So let's create alternative people management systems because people need to be managed. The idea that everybody can just radically self-manage is absurd. We all need accountability. And so sometimes therapy is accountability in the simplest, most mundane way. And sometimes therapy is life-saving accountability, where it helps you not die by suicide or impulsively use drugs and die in a car crash or something. So the idea that we don't need any management or control is absolutely silly and absurd. The question is it voluntary? Is it consensual? Or is it draconian management of people? Is it authoritarian? And so this is just one of those silly posts, in my opinion. But you tell me if you disagree. Next up, we have, I think, in my opinion, we have some interesting things to discuss. And I want to get to this because I think it's actually a big deal. I think it's actually a huge deal. So let me retweet this real quick. This is one of my posts. from earlier this week, 2 days ago. Okay. So, this is me responding to Nick Tabor. For those of you who don't know, Nick Tabor is someone I've collaborated with and talked with on Twitter many times, disagreed with and agreed with. Nick put out a post talking about the epistemic violence in the mental health system. He says there's no scientific grounding in the field. And here's what I said in response to that. I'm summarizing what he said. I said, and I quote 2 days ago, "We have roughly 150 years of research and theory, one could call science, supporting principles of, for instance, basic behaviorism, which works across species. Harm? Yes, some lazy therapists blame the patients on the harm they cause. Sometimes people own their mistakes, professionals do. Sometimes the patient is not trying and they're still hurting themselves. Sometimes the relationship is the problem, often." So, let's talk about one of the things that I said that got me in some hot water with some people. Let's talk about the fact that human beings are animals real quick and how this applies to being a clinician. So, I believe very firmly, and it could be someone else's opinion that this is extreme, so feel free to cancel me for this. But I believe that human beings are closer to other mammals with similar genetic lineages than we are different. We are more similar than we are different. And we have these self-serving biases that keep us thinking we're uniquely special. Okay, so, and there's a comment here that I want to respond to that I think speaks to this problem. So, with regard to my last topic about control and management of people, Edmund says, what percentage of people need to be controlled? People that are acutely dangerous to themselves and other people certainly need to be controlled. I have no clue what percentage of the population that actually is in real time. Now, what percentage of the population needs to be managed versus controlled? Everyone. Every last one of us needs to be managed. We need accountability. We need systems of accountability. And that's what I call management. Just like a boss or a manager at work manages your productivity, your tasks, and things like that. Project manager, whatever. Humans need that about the rest of their life. We just think of it in a more pro-social, non-economic way, right? But all of us need to be managed. And we need self-management, but we also need other management. We call it accountability. And this perfectly blends into this next topic, which is we are animals. And I feel like that's not particularly uncontroversial. The idea that the average person walking around is so radically different than a chimpanzee or a bonobo or a gorilla or whatever is absurd to me. And the reason I say this, and this might be one of my more controversial takes, is because if you look at all of the similarities that we have with these other species that share much of our genome in common, we function very, very similarly. And the ways in which we're different, which have been, I think, blown out of proportion by most people because of self-serving biases, keep us stuck in maladaptive ways of functioning in the world, right? And so let me just walk this out for a second. If you take a look at all of the great research that's been done by people like Jane Goodall and Franz de Waal, and then you take a look at the neuroscience research that most clinical psychology professionals hold near and dear to their beliefs about human well-being, right? How much of neuroscience uses other animals, like rats in particular, who have a similar central nervous system as us? How many of those animal models do we use to relate to human behavior, neuroanatomy, psychology, and things like that? Great researchers have studied similar behaviors, if not the exact same behaviors, in most other species for over 100 years with experiments, with neuroanatomical studies, all these things. We function very, very similarly, and we have brains that are very similar to other species that are like us. We have the same needs as every other species. We need to belong. We need to be important. We need to have purpose. We need to be loved. We need status. We need success. We need rest. We need play. We need love. All of these things are not unique to us. Read famous researcher, neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, who did so much work with other animals and humans. And Jaak Panksepp's work in his books like, The Archaeology of the Mind and things like that, explains this very straightforwardly. Humans are very similar to most other similar species. Even species that are very different than us, like rats. Most of you probably don't know this, but rats like to laugh. And so do humans. Now, are we exactly like our house cats and our dogs? No, of course not. So it's not like I'm saying, that like humans are no better than and have no substantial differences than other species. We might as well just all be in zoos or something. No, but you know what's fascinating is although most people hate zoos, and I am not a fan of zoos at all, it's interesting how we've created our own zoos. We call them cities. A city is basically a zoo. And I think that is something that we should be clear about, is that we do everything we can to function and manage ourselves like other species do. Hey, Darren, glad you're here. So my point, albeit controversial, is this. Many of the principles that work for every other species we've studied also work for humans, right? If any of you have ever owned a pet, you have done with a pet what a therapist does with a patient. Now, that might sound very demeaning, and that is not my intention. So if you ever trained a dog or a cat to do something, that is exactly what clinicians do. Because what happens when you're training a dog to fetch or a cat to respond to, a toy or something like that? What you're doing is two things. You're using principles of behaviorism, which I'll go over in a second, but you're also leveraging the emotional relationship you have with that creature. And that is exactly what is happening. In all types of therapy, whether it's super deep psychoanalytic work or more quote unquote shallow behaviorism, CBT, whatever. So the silly idea that humans, in my opinion, are not radically different or something like that, I think it's worth considering for everyone, especially in the profession, like how unique are our relationships? Like what exactly are we holding as sacred and what exactly are we holding as banal and normal? So most therapists hold the relationship as sacred, right? And I think that's great. I think the therapeutic relationship is one of the most sacred things that we should protect and pay extra close attention to. And as a clinical supervisor, I teach my interns how to pay attention to countertransference experiences, transference dynamics, tracking progress, goals, relationship dynamics, emotions, things like that, which is exactly what we do, albeit more superficially, with other creatures in life. And so I do not think it is all that radical to extrapolate what is successful with other animals to human beings. Just like you can teach a dog to sit by using the concept of shaping. And for those of you who don't know, shaping is this wonderful but really strange technique from basic behaviorism that works great. And you can do it with your spouse or significant other if you're in a relationship. Could be fun. But shaping is where you ignore bad behavior, the behavior you don't want to continue, and you reward or praise good behavior, right? So like if I want my other half to get better at putting away the dishes, as opposed to bitching and complaining and moaning every time they don't put away the dishes, which is a punishment behavior. All you do is ignore them when they don't do it. You might do things like ask them to do it, and then if they do it, you praise them. Or if they do it spontaneously, you praise them. So this kind of differential reinforcement, right? This praising behavior, we call it shaping, works phenomenally well, and it's used in all sorts of types of therapy all the time. And it happens on a micro scale all the time, right? So you can teach a dog to sit or give you their paw by using shaping, by praising specifically. You can do the same thing with a human being, and human beings do it all the time unconsciously. And therapists also do this unconsciously all the time. Edmund says, managing equals shaping. Yes, exactly. Managing relationships is either some combination of punishment or reward or shaping, right? Now, the problem with shaping is it's hard to do because we often want to be critical or blame or punish people. And so that's what gets in the way of actually doing shaping correctly. So really, this concept of like other animals being radically different than us is true in some domains because many animals don't have the same sophistication of communication styles or grasp of intellect and tool usage. There's great books on this, by the way. And if you don't believe anything I'm saying, just feel free to read all of the ethology literature. Like take a spin through the ecology and ethology literature where we compare species behaviors. Also, there's great books like From Bacteria to Bach, and another great book is Darwin's Unfinished Symphony, which talks about why we're different. And so all of these books that I'm referencing are yours to read, and you feel free to disagree with me. Here's what I would say. All of the ways in which we are similar are some of the most important things that we focus on in therapy. And so the fact that humans are just like other creatures that share most of our genome and stuff like that is awesome and not some kind of dig at humanity. But people reacted as if I was saying that humans are stupid pigeons that can be trained, which is not what I mean, because I don't think humans are pigeons. Humans are not rats. Humans are not chimpanzees or bonobos or macaques or whatever. Humans are humans. So Phil says, I'm okay, you're okay. Of course we are. But the idea that humans are extremely similar in 7 or 8 important psychological, emotional, evolutionary domains is what we can certainly capitalize on. And that's why I use the example of basic behaviorism. It's 100% the case that shaping works on humans. It's 100% the case that slot machine principle that many of you have learned about in economics and things like that is true. If you don't think humans are like other animals, you can do the exact same study with rats and chimpanzees and get them to operate on, variable interval reinforcement schedules or variable ratio reinforcement schedules, no differently than a human being who goes to Las Vegas and gets sucked into a casino on a slot machine for 5 hours. We are, in that particular way, exactly the same. We are motivated by variable ratio reinforcement schedules, no differently than any other species. But one of the important differences we have is we have all these layers of social and lifestyle complexity that other species do not have. So because we are more intelligent in many ways, we have complexity that other animals don't have. And so the idea that we can create cool music that other species don't create, we can create rockets, which other species at least have not yet created, right? But other species have tool usage. Other species have music. Angie says, tell me something cool. So here's something cool, Angie. Here's something cool. What's cool is the basic principles and the basic problems and needs of other species are the exact same principles and problems in the human species. And so when people got upset with me about saying that humans respond just like rats do and stuff, I mean that in the most positive possible way, because it means that a lot of what we have to do is simple, but we overcomplicate it because we want to feel special. And that, I think, is the beautiful gift of behavior change, is all of us can engage in behavior change, and we don't have to overcomplicate it with shit about your childhood, your culture, your gender, your sexuality, and all that stuff. That being said, you can certainly add all of those layers, and they can be emotionally meaningful. However, you don't need to fully address any of those extra layers in order to achieve behavior change. And that is the beauty of clinical psychology, is what we're trying to do is come up with a human universal way of understanding motivation, behavior change, and emotion management. And so the best attempt at this, which is still effective, is basic behaviorism. That doesn't mean that that is the only solution or that I think it's the best solution. But what I'm telling you is that if you do the basics of behaviorism correctly with anybody, their behavior will start to change. Now, I can already hear the psychoanalytic types yelling and screaming like, no, but your behavior won't stay changed because blah, 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 in your childhood and mom and dad, and especially mom. And fair enough. Some people will go back to self-defeating patterns because they learned early in life that they don't matter, or they're too narcissistic or borderline or whatever it is. And fair enough. I think personality is very important. I've said that before on this podcast. So what I'm trying to say is that if we look at ourselves as not amazingly different, but just different enough from other animals, then we'll have a more realistic set of expectations, in therapy. In any behavior change process you're doing, whether it's coping skills or ACT or DBT or CBT or psychoanalysis, acknowledging the ways in which we are similar to animals is exactly how Freud got started. So the analytic type shouldn't be losing their hair over this one, but for some reason they do. And it's really simple to me. If we can acknowledge that we are animals, just like our cousins, our closest cousins like bonobos and chimpanzees, then what we can do is we can start from a shared reality of what motivates us and what manages us. And what motivates us is belonging. What motivates us is status. What manages us is status. What manages us is other people that we can be accountable to. And that is the hard part about being a person, is all those complicated psychosocial layers of culture and gender and section, all these things, and thinking. All the thinking is what messes up our ability to do these basic things like stay accountable to each other, because we have all sorts of feelings about the person trying to help us, right? So for me, I am not saying, just to be clear, that humans are in zero ways special or different than other species. What I am saying specifically is that people, like Edmund is saying, people are being brainwashed to believe that they are so special and so different that we cannot do these simple things that other animals do and need. We have the exact same needs. They're just different in how they are expressed and thought about. So Edmund asked a question. Can you be brainwashed in a language you cannot understand? Absolutely. Animals have rudimentary language skills. They don't have zero language skills. All animals communicate. Some of them communicate through verbal utterances and sounds. Birds, cats, dogs, chimpanzees, all of these creatures have a semi-formal language system. We have specifically more complicated language skills than other animals do. And animals are brainwashed in languages they do not understand, right? And human beings are also brainwashed and manipulated in languages they don't understand. Because we pay attention to prosody, we pay attention to patterns of speech, we pay attention to what sounds like emotional tones. Yelling and screaming in French is not radically different than yelling and screaming in Hindi, which is not relatively different than yelling and screaming in German or English. So the idea that we are radically different, I think, is something we should contend with as a profession, but also as people. And not to say that humans are not special, just that we are not special in the way that we think we are. It's amazing that we have created all this science and technology, and I'm grateful for it because it's the reason I can do this podcast and stuff. However, at the 30,000 foot level, we're doing a lot of the same things. Birds making calls in the trees to their friends across the forest, you know what I mean? To get their attention is what I'm doing right now. And that, I think, is important. So these rat tricks, teaching rats to respond in a Pavlovian way or a Skinnerian way is something humans do to each other, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. But does that mean we have no special worth or value? No, we are different. So once we contend with the fact that we are human and different than other animals, but also very similar, then we can see the ways that we're similar and use that to our advantage to change our behavior in a way that suits our goals. And that is what good therapy does. Good therapy leverages the relationship and leverages what is motivating or rewarding, if you want to be behaviorist about it, and demotivating for a person to change. That's all good therapy does. That is the premise of motivational interviewing and solution-focused therapy. And those are wildly effective therapies. So dear Nick Tabor and everybody else who had a problem with it, especially the analytic types, maybe if you acknowledge the ways in which you're an animal, you'd be more successful and get more done more quickly. That's my hot take. Which I want to bring in a new post because this is exactly related to what I was just saying. So most of you have heard about attachment styles or attachment theory. And this post I'm going to discuss right now relates to that. And before I get to the particular post, I want to set the table. So if what I've just said and laid out is remotely true, that, humans are maybe even 10% more similar to animals than we think we are. Angela says, we're all just a bunch of dumb monkeys, really. I agree. I think that's true. I really think that's true. And I don't mean it in a stigmatizing way. I mean it like a freeing kind of way. Yeah, we live in our emotions. I agree. So here's my premise. If it's true that we're similar to other animals, that means we can generalize, not rigidly generalize, just loosely generalize what works for them to what works for us, which is exactly how, by the way, people like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s picked up the project of attachment theory. Bowlby studied ethology, etholog, to try and figure out how other animals handle early infancy. So, Bowlby looked at how other animals manage those parent-infant dynamics and tried to extrapolate that to humans. And it worked. And people love attachment theory. It resonates superficially with pretty much everyone now. And so that brings me to this post from 4 days ago. This is, again, a person I have never spoken to that I'm aware of. So, 4 days ago, this person called Callan, and their handle on Twitter is at CALLANABLE. And here's what they said. Much of what got diagnosed as anxious attachment was an accurate read of being in relationships where I was more invested than they were. Nobody said that. Individual therapists, couples therapists, friends and family, and members of support groups all parroted the same advice. Learn to self-soothe, you anxious attachment type. Enjoy spending time alone. Build a diverse support network. Journal, meditate, exercise, try an SSRI, CBT, DBT, EMDR, ACT, hypnotherapy. Quote unquote, you're safe now. You're just overreacting. You're traumatized. There is no threat. He is secure. You are anxious. Do the work. So I bought all the books, Dutifully went from therapist to therapist for years, tried all the modalities, got medicated. In quotes, you have an attachment disorder and your relationships keep failing because of it. You are too much. Keep doing the work. So I did for years, but the work wasn't healing. It was filing me down. I was chronically chosen by avoidant attachment men, and kept being told that if I became less reactive, everything would be fine. Boy, doesn't that sound similar. I was more than happy to take full responsibility for every problem, to self-diagnose into oblivion. After all, if I'm the problem, I can control it. My anxiety wasn't simply a trauma response, though. It was like a smoke detector going off in a house that was, in fact, on fire. And everyone just kept saying, here's some earplugs. Oh, and try not to cough too much. So I'm going to stop there, but her post goes on for a while, I think her. So I want to say thank you first to Callan for this post, because it speaks exactly to what I'm saying. And so here's what happens and why I think Therapy Land, which is the world's worst theme park, gets out of control. So in Therapy Land, everyone has an attachment style. Usually it's the 4 types: the secure, the insecure avoidant, the insecure ambivalent or preoccupied, anxious, or the insecure fearful or traumatized. And then in theory, you can become secure or whatever. And so this is the problem, is when people, especially unsophisticated clinicians, get a hold of an idea that has been oversimplified, then what we do is we convince people that they are especially broken in some unique way. Now, if you go all the way back to John Bowlby's early writings, Bowlby never said that any of these other attachment styles were inherently pathological. So what this person Callan is trying to say, that they figured out at some point, I think, is that after years of beating their head against the wall and getting nowhere and feeling worse and worse and worse, what they realized is that they have a smoke detector that's actually more accurate than inaccurate. In fact, Randy Ness, the evolutionary psychiatrist, says this, that a lot of anxiety and anxiety disorders relate to a broken smoke detector, a smoke detector that's too sensitive to things that are like the stove is just normally cooking or something. And so this individual, Callan, is talking about exactly that. It is 100% the case that as animals, we are sensitive to signs of attachment distress. And sometimes we're good at avoiding it if we're avoidantly attached. And sometimes if we're anxiously attached or ambivalently or preoccupied, whatever label you like, you're going to have a stronger reaction. But that stronger reaction isn't inherently pathological. That stronger reaction might be a crystal clear read of a change that something is wrong. Sometimes it is an overreaction. But what mediocre therapists do is they tell people to read into it and pathologize themselves as opposed to just noticing it, which is different than, oh my God, something is wrong with you, if that makes sense. Darren says, Dunning-Kruger effect, I suspect. You mean for the therapist or for the patient? Edmund says, a trigger by any other name. Yeah, exactly. So what I would say is, if we take seriously the idea that we are very similar to other animals, then it's perfectly valid to say that these so-called attachment styles are our unique ways of reacting to separation distress. And we're all built differently, so we all might react more or less. We might underreact if we're avoidantly attached. We might overreact if we're anxiously attached. But that's not the end of the story, as this Callan person is talking about. Because if what you're told is you are uniquely, specially broken, and any distress you feel is a sign of your problem, that is not the same thing as saying you might be extra sensitive, and it might be real and it might not be, as significant as you think it is. And so this is the problem with therapy, in my opinion, or this is one of the many problems in therapy land, the world's worst theme park, is that people who are trying to oversimplify things are making people worse. We are making people sicker by taking these 30,000 foot concepts like attachment theory and oversimplifying them. There's these 4 styles, and that's the end of the story. Or you're a narcissist, or you're a borderline, and that's the end of the story. And when in reality, that is not the end of the story. That is only one layer of how your mind is organized. And so until we have serious professionals who are willing to talk about all the layers of being a person, on the psychological side, the sociological side, and the biological side, I think what's happening in therapy is very, very harmful to a lot of people, including this Callan person, where we are oversimplifying distress. We are quick to slap a label on it, an attachment style, a disorder, and that is a problem. Angie says, the mental health industry and social media has made everyone neurotic and self-focused and self-help junkies. Exactly. 100%. And that is why I would like to get back to understanding how we are similar to animals, by the way. Because being self-focused doesn't seem to be very adaptive for any species. Thinking doesn't seem to be particularly adaptive for most species. Angie says, I am so sick of thinking about the way my mind works and what's wrong with it. Amen. There's no need. Most of the time, most people walking around on the planet right now do not need to have some 24/7 introspection process. It's not useful. It's almost never useful for people. And so the problem that we face, genuinely, is the problem of dealing with this need for introspection in a way that's healthy. And I just don't see thinking all the time being the solution. I just don't. And that is the big problem, in my opinion. That is the serious problem. And I hate how we ignore the ways in which we are just like every other animal. And this is the problem, is our system, our profession, makes it too complicated. And it tells us to think as opposed to do something. So, Edmund says, the inefficiency of self-inspection is the bad part. I don't know what you mean by that, if you can clarify. I'd love to know more about what you mean. So, just to reiterate, while Edmund's probably saying and clarifying something, I think we have a really cool opportunity as a profession. And those of you in the chat who are in the profession, or at least tangential to it, you can help, which is to acknowledge how we are very simple in some ways, but also complicated. We have complicated social systems, but our behaviors are not that complicated. And we could do things to simplify them to some degree. Yeah, Darren says, great example, Darren. If you feel terror because you see a shark coming at you, that's a normal reaction. I'm pretty sure it doesn't need deep exploration. And many things we experience all day require zero depth. None. Edmund says, we don't change fast enough with introspection. Well, I think, Edmund, I don't think introspection is the cause of change. I think rarely is introspection the type of intrinsic motivation that forces people to change. I think if people are reckoning with their values or their core needs, then they're more interested in being motivated and changing. But a lot of introspection is about sketching out the territory and mapping out the territory. And that I think is mostly useless. And that is, again, back to behaviorism. That's why I like basic behaviorism. A basic, antecedent behavior consequence applies to all humans and all other animals. And it works perfectly. Now, is that a long-term success strategy? No, but it's certainly a short-term success strategy. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, is have a more adult conversation about the ways in which we have chosen to ignore the obvious "you're reacting to a shark" thing that Darren's talking about, because we are primitive in that way, and we should be, because we're just like every other animal. We respond to direct threats. We respond to threats for safety, inclusion, esteem, status, like every other species. And if you don't believe me, just go watch people argue on Twitter. Watch therapy Twitter. Some of the least well-adjusted people, some of the least mindful, least healthy people are on therapy Twitter, myself included. And we're out there being absurd, in my opinion. And sometimes it's fun, and my goal is to have more fun, obviously. But it's not a question of thinking things and knowing things. It's a question of being in alignment with our values and our motivations, and being clear about how primitive those values and motivations are. They are not deep and profound. Our need for status, our need for belonging, our need for acknowledgement, our need to feel important is not some deep philosophical premise. It's about as shallow as it gets because it's in every species. The problem is, as many of you are saying in this chat, is we think about it too much, which is fucking absurd, I think. That's just me. So, I think I've beaten that point into the ground. And so I'd like to kind of round out today's episode with a post from my buddy Ryan. And so some of you probably follow him. Some of you do not. And if you don't, I encourage you to follow him. So on Twitter, his name is at Virgil MSW, VIRGIL MSW. And his name is Ryan Malfris. So Ryan, I think, is a great follow. He's a reasonable person, in my opinion. And he said this 3 days ago, and I'd like to talk about it because I think hope is important. So here's what he said 3 days ago. He said, "I think hope is important. I was just reading a Nancy McWilliams book, and she talked about the importance of holding hope for another at times in the context of psychotherapy. I think this concept can be seen in any general movement for change. At least one person needs to believe change is possible. That vision needs to be articulated and believed as a distinct possibility before it can be acted out as a new behavior. But before any of that will be done, hope needs to exist on at least one person's part." That's what I'm thinking at the moment. Well, thank you. So I basically agree with everything he said. And I really think this is very important for everyone who is in therapy, couples therapy, counseling, coaching, rehab, outpatient clinics, psych hospitals. It is our ethical duty as providers, as professionals, to hold hope for people, to be rational optimists, because that is the scientific reality. If you are paying close attention to the literature on behavior change and human well-being, life continues to get better despite all the bad things happening in the world, which means that we are not only capable of surviving and thriving, but it seems to be a norm despite bad things. And I don't think anyone who knows me or listens to me would consider me Pollyanna or naive. So it is my firm belief that it is my ethical obligation as a provider to be the person in the relationship that holds hope for behavior change, which will eventually correlate to internal change. And I believe it is my duty to hold hope and role model it, and to instill and inspire hope in other people. It is often the case when it comes to the severely or chronically or persistently mentally ill that people think about them with no hope. It is a shame. It is malpractice, in my opinion, that psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, LPCs, whatever, look at people with severe conditions like schizophrenia or severe bipolar or personality disorders and go, that's hopeless, which is not true. Some of the sickest people are capable of amazing change. Some of the most successful people that are in the public eye that all of you know are severely ill, and you just don't know it. Angie says, I am one of the few that holds hope for people with iatrogenic injury and get hated for it. It's wild. It is wild. It's wild that those of us trying to be rationally optimistic and clear and principled get all the hell, but the naysayers and the pessimists and the cowards who hide behind intellectualized analytic thought or intellectualized psychosocial cultural baggage, they are the problem, in my opinion. But they get thousands and thousands of likes and status because they're worrying out loud. Edmund says, very aptly, where there is life, there is hope. Exactly. As long as we're alive, there is a possibility that things can change. JFK once said, change is the law of life. So long as you're alive, change is possible. Maybe it'll happen because you want it to, or maybe it will happen despite you, but it will happen. And so we should absolutely have hope as professionals. I have said many times in this podcast that I do not like doing clinical work at all. But I always have hope for the people that I work with, even though it's not enjoyable, because I know for a fact that most of the things they want to change are very changeable. Very changeable. Angie said, I was chronic, persistent mental ill and on disability for 13 years. Everyone gave up on me. They were wrong. I recovered, got a master's degree, pushing back on that bullshit. No one believed me. 18 years. 18 years. That's amazing. It's amazing that you are where you're at. And I'm so glad that you're doing what you can do in your niche in this industry. And that's what we all should be thinking about. Like, I wish more people in society understood ecology, the study of different species and how these environments work together. Because it takes all kinds to make life better for people. It takes the optimists. It takes the critics. It takes the people who are dedicated to this, that, or the other intervention, the behaviorists and the ACT people and the psychoanalysts. We all need to be here because we all contribute to things getting better. And what we should be optimistic about, in my opinion, is the fact that things continue to get better despite all the bad stuff happening in the world. Isn't that amazing? It's absurd. And thank goodness. And so to you pessimists out there, I encourage you to grow up and figure it out. Maybe go to therapy. Maybe figure out why you're so pessimistic. But that's BS. If people who are severely ill can get better, if people can get out of jail and live a better life, then most people can get better. I have so many stories in my head of very, very sick people who came from very disadvantaged backgrounds getting better. And I would hate if anyone in the profession chose the pessimistic approach to people getting better. I'm even optimistic about the profession because there's so many people like Angie and my buddy Ryan and all these people that are trying to share non-typical perspectives on the profession. There's so many people out there who are being critical, but are also trying to build better systems. And that is cause for optimism because I don't see systems being burned to the ground. I see systems being criticized, challenged, and strengthened. And that is what is great. And so if you are pessimistic, you are the problem. If you're in the profession and you're pessimistic, you are the problem. And as much as I'm critical of profession, I am not pessimistic because I see good people trying to do the right thing. I see people that try, despite their flaws and their struggles, to do the right thing. And that gives me optimism. As a professor in graduate psychology, I see all sorts of new people joining the profession who I think can actually help and make a difference. They have the knowledge, the skills, the insight, the talent to do it. So I'm optimistic. Very optimistic. Angie says, yes, we are building something else. It's hard for me to explain it. Yeah, we don't even know all of the ways in which it's going to be improved. We're building a lot of different things. And the cool thing is every one of these new businesses, every one of these new avenues can make life better for people. In the pro-psychiatry and the anti-psychiatry world, in the pro-therapy and the anti-therapy world, everyone's life can get better. Thomas says, can you speak to the role of stigmatization in staunching hope? Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very important that when we have stigma because of illness, we lose hope, right? And it's easy to lose hope if you become a label or a box, right? So if you are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or schizophrenia or bipolar, those three labels can feel fatalistic or hopeless because those are three of the illnesses that are seen as chronic and either difficult to treat or hard to treat and impossible to stay in remission. And because of that, that stigma about, oh my gosh, I have this label now, can cause people to lose hope and therefore not try. And that, I think, is why it's so important to be clear about how we're talking about these issues. That's why I take a nuanced approach to personality, because how you're organized is important. Your temperament, your big five, but also how you're organized in terms of the DSM traits and stuff like that is important. But that's not the end of the story, because your personality organization or your symptoms of mental illness are not the end of who you are. And it's often the case that our symptoms of mental illness are not actually about mental illness, because sometimes it's about the crappy circumstance we're in. And people forget that. People forget that, your symptoms of mental illness can be because you're in a crappy relationship, or you choose to surround yourself with losers. And I hate to say it that way, but it's true. Many people have chosen to only surround themselves with people who are going nowhere. People who are otherwise capable of succeeding in life, but choosing not to because they have crappy parents, friends themselves. And so it's amazing what can happen when you find someone, for instance, as Thomas is saying, who has hope. If you find someone who can understand you and help you feel seen and understood, that's a really good start. If you find someone that is like you who's succeeding in the world, if you find a good mentor, if you get a new job at a new company, if you make a new friend, if you go to a different environment than you were previously in, like you go to the gym, people who are trying to work on themselves, all these environments can reshape the way you see yourself. And that's not mental illness, right? So I think we stigmatize people by thinking of them as their boxes or their labels. And people self-stigmatize all the time by caring about so-called symptoms when sometimes their symptoms are not symptoms. Sometimes their symptoms are medical issues, like hormone conditions, cancer, heart disease. Sometimes their symptoms are medication related, as Angie would tell you. Angie said, we just did a 3-hour workshop this morning and it was great. Good. I'm glad you're doing that. I think we should always have hope. We should try to be clear about the language we're using and if we're trying to make life better for people, or if we're trying to put people in a box so we can compartmentalize them and make our lives easier, especially as professionals. And there are plenty of ethical professionals out there. They're just quietly working and you've never heard from them. They're not on Twitter being ridiculous like myself and my colleagues. They're secretly, quietly just working, doing their own thing, living good lives. And that's why I'm optimistic. And that is all for today. I am out of time and out of breath. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for commenting, chatting, sharing. It's awesome to have you here. Thank you all for showing up in the chat, asking, pushing back, questioning, sharing your opinions. Really appreciate it. Makes this better. If you thought this was helpful, interesting, challenging, I hope that you like, share, and subscribe and all that good stuff. I also hope that you share it with people that might be in a similar predicament, who feel lost, confused. And I really, really hope that something challenged the way you think about these things naturally, and it allowed you to have a different perspective. That's my goal. And as always, I try to end on something funny if I can. And so earlier today, I had this thought. I think owls are kind of cool. There's different kinds of owls. And I thought, what would an owl call a barn dance? Well, an owl would probably call a barn dance a hootenanny. All right. Good to see you all. Catch you next week for another episode of UnShrink Me. And I will hopefully see you soon. Please take good care of yourselves and the people around you. Eat good food, have good sex, have good fun, sleep good, and it will be better for you. And I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.